Hello and welcome to the first of our Globe and Next Generation Science Standards webinars. Thank you to everyone who's able to join us today. We are recording this session and will make the recording available in a day or two through a link in the Teaching and Learning section of the Globe website. Our objectives today are to provide the U.S. Globe community members with a basic introduction to the next generation science standards and have a conversation about how Globe fits with the next generation science standards. We'll begin with an introduction to NGSS and the Three Dimensions by Michigan Globe partner David Babowski. Then I'll guide us through taking a closer look at the student performance expectations. I'll also demonstrate how to get from the Globe website to NGSS resources. Finally, Kristen will lead us in a brainstorming session of ideas on how to cover NGSS within our Globe professional development. To get us started, here's David with an introduction to NGSS.
Good afternoon, everybody, or morning, as might be more appropriate in your area. My name is Dave Bydlowski. I'm a science consultant at Wayne Risa, which is just outside the metropolitan Detroit area. And so I'm very happy to be here to talk about the next generation science standards in Globe. As Marcy talked about, the three of us will be sharing information and hopefully might have some questions that you might have later, maybe provide some information, and look forward to you sharing your ideas as well. As we look at the next generation science standards, this has been an evolution and maybe eventually then a revolution in the way that we look at science education in the United States. And the first slide that I'm showing you kind of goes over the changes that have taken place in the past 20 years in terms of science education. It was back in the 1990s when two documents came out that were very important. One was the Framework for Science Education, and the second was Benchmarks for Scientific Literacy. And both of these documents really help states prepare their set of standards or expectations or objectives, whatever they might be called. And they kind of set that precedent. And so that if you were to go back and look at most of the states in the United States, you'd notice that there would be a strong connection back to these national science standards or the benchmarks for scientific literacy. But then over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of research which has taken place in science education. What is the best way that students learn? What is most valuable for learning? And when we look at science, science itself has changed. In many ways, science is the same, but obviously it's radically different in many ways. So it was a time to build on that past, but prepare for the future of science education. So these documents and that research led to what was called the Framework for K-12 Science Education, which is a really important document. And I would encourage you to go back and read that if possible. If you go to the website nap.edu, that's nap.edu. And if you check that out, you'll notice, I think, on the second screen that you can download the PDF of the document or you can buy it for $50. But what it did over the past couple of years was to have scientists come together and decide what is really important for students to know in terms of science. Then, once this document was written and we had an idea of what science education should look like, we then took it to the educational community and started looking at what that would look like in terms of grade level. What would the progression be? What would grades look like? And that led us to the next generation science standards, which were released in April of 2013. And at this point, last time I looked, 5 states in the United States had approved those. We're a lead state in Michigan, and I've been on the Michigan review team for the next generation science standards. We've not approved the document yet, but it is on the table at our Michigan State Board of Education. So hopefully we will be approving those within the next couple of months. But it's this whole process which has led to these standards. So One of the things that I think people kind of forget about is what is the research behind the next generation science standards. That's what you see there in the first column. But then in that second column, that phase one was really important in writing the next generation science standards. What did we really want students to know? What does the scientific community say is most important? And that was all put together into the next generation science standards. So, what we'll see today, and what we're seeing across the country today, is this whole conceptual shift that's taking place in the next generation science standards. And one of the things that we talk about too is this whole nature of science and practices of science and real world science. And when we talk about the nature of science, very often people just think about the scientific method. But what the nature of science, I think, is really trying to get at is that we go beyond, science is really going beyond this scientific method, as we often talk about. There's real goals of science. We form laws, we form theories, we talk about scientific knowledge that it's reliable, yet it's tentative information. We also talk about the practices and the cross-cutting concepts of science, and so that as we look at science, we know that it has a very large social impact. So that's what we talk about more than just going beyond what just a scientific method. We're really talking about this whole nature of science, and the term practiced is very important because, as we'll see, we talk about the practices of science, not inquiry science, as we've used for so many years. And the reason for going to the practices of science is that when we look at what does a scientist do? What do people in science do on a regular basis? It's more than just doing experiments or reading. It's really questioning, but it's also analyzing data. It's also writing. It's also sharing. So all of those pieces are very important in our next generation science standards. And I think the other piece that's very prominent is the real world application of these expectations. So hopefully that kind of gives a flavor of the next generation science standards, where it's come from and why we have it today. One of the unique aspects of the next generation science standards, which are different than most of the other state standards, expectations, objectives that states have had, is this whole intertwining of the three dimensions of science. And those are the practices, core ideas, and cross cutting concepts. I think everybody has been very familiar with the core ideas of science in terms of physical science, life science, and earth science. So that's not particularly new to anybody. And in many respects, that's how science was, in terms of objectives, expectations were written before, anyways. But now within each one of our expectations is a practice of science. And those practices include asking questions, developing models, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, using math and computational thinking, constructing explanations, engaging in arguments, and then obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Those are the practices of science. But we'll also see that those are the practices of engineering. Along with those practices within every expectation are the cross cutting concepts. And those are those really big ideas of science that cross cut all of the disciplines of science: patterns, cause and effect, scale, proportion, and quantity, systems, energy and matter, structure and function, stability and change, and those aspects. And then also bringing in the nature of science and engineering. So within every one of our expectations, you will find a core idea of science. You'll see the practices of science, and then you'll see the major cross-cutting concepts of science. Every one of the expectations is written as a performance expectation. And as Marcy will talk about, that will be one of the major shifts. That we're not looking at a curriculum of necessarily what to teach, we're really looking at what to assess. And then how do we go about doing that? And that will be the real focus of today's work. The practices and the content that I've talked about have been supported by many different pieces of research and many different types of results, a few which are listed here. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, where you have the intertwining of both the practices, the cross-cutting concepts, and the core ideas, that's not a new idea as well. That's come through science research as well, as you see in the intertwined strands of proficiency from learning science in informal environments and taking science to school. Taking the research that we've had in the past to develop the best practices of science education. And America's Lab Report is another document that's worth looking at. That, as you can see there, exemplifies what we see in our next generation science standards. So as we start looking at the relationship between GLOBE and the next generation science standards, I think the most important part of this introduction is to emphasize that the next generation science standards have evolved from research and from previous documents that showed us the best methods by which to perform scientific education. We also looked at the role of science experts in defining science in terms of the framework for K-12 education before we eventually went to the framework and or the next generation science standards, and those were built on research documents, so that a lot of research has been done to develop the standards that we have today. And with this, I'll pass that on to Marcy, and she'll start talking more about these performance expectations.
Thanks, David. So now we're going to take a closer look at the student performance expectations. In NGSS, the standards are presented as student performance expectations. This is the second of the 6 big major conceptual shifts in the new standards. The standards describe achievement, not instruction. The standards are not a description of the curriculum. So let me repeat that in slightly different words. The standards are not a description of what should happen in the classroom during instruction. They are a description of what the student should be able to do when instruction is complete. So let's take a closer look at a couple of examples. Here I have a 3rd grade example from Earth and Space Science. And let's see, you can see my pointer now, I think. Is that correct? Okay, great. So we have the student performance expectations at the top, and they're all coded in a specific way. The first number, 3, is the grade level. The next few letters are the disciplinary area: life science, earth science, physical science. So in this case, it's earth and space science. And then the number is the component idea. And then in this case, we have 2 standards, or 2 student performance expectations. We're going to focus on the top one: represent data in tables and graphical displays to describe typical weather conditions expected during a particular season. And you can see after this standard, there's some red text. The red texts are clarification statements and assessment boundaries. These statements help us understand the scope of what is to be assessed, and help us also not go beyond what would be expected of every student at that grade level. Not all of the student performance objectives have boundary statements and clarification statements. The 3 colored boxes below provide a list of the dimensions that are built into this group of student performance expectations. So for the student performance expectation that we are focusing on, students are working on analyzing and interpreting data. They're also working on this disciplinary core idea that scientists record patterns of weather across different times and areas so that they can make predictions about what kind of weather might happen next. And they're working on patterns of change are used to make predictions. And those 3 things are part of the final assessment. So if this is what will be assessed, represent data in tables and graphical displays to describe typical weather conditions expected during a particular season. Then what could or should happen in the classroom to prepare the students to be assessed? That's really the million-dollar question. That's the thing that teachers are going to be discussing and using to prepare their curriculums. And in this case, I have some suggestions. Perhaps in preparing to be assessed on this standard, students could collect cloud, air temperature, and precipitation using the GLOBE protocols regularly. Students could learn to access their own and other students' GLOBE data from the website. Students could be doing activities from the Earth System poster packet and describing how observations, I'm sorry, the word how is a typo there, and describing their observation of seasonal change in and between factors on the poster. And students could be interpreting graphs of data. That's not necessarily students representing their own data in graphs and tables. It's not necessarily them displaying other data in graphs and tables yet. But if they did all of these things, then they may be ready to be assessed on the standard. Oh, I want to go back. I'm sorry. So in this example, the students in this classroom, having done these activities, would have actually be engaged in several of the NGSS practices of science and engineering. They would have been obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information as they learned how to access their data and other students' data from the website. They would have been constructing explanations as they analyzed those patterns on the Earth System poster and tried to make sense of them. And they would have been doing all of that while building their understanding of seasonal patterns. So that by the time they were done doing all these activities, they would be able to represent data in tables and graphs and then interpret those representations to explain how specific weather conditions are expected in specific seasons. Here's a second student performance expectation. And what I'd like for us to do is, if this is what is to be assessed, this is for 5th grade Earth and Space Science, develop a model using an example to describe ways the geosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, and/or atmosphere interact. There is an assessment boundary on this standard, and that is that the students only need to connect 2 of the 4 spheres. Does anyone have any ideas about GLOBE activities that students might do in their classrooms to get ready to be assessed on this standard? And you can type into the chat window. Any of the Earth as a System activities, water, pH, and precipitation. I'm just going to read aloud the ideas so that we have it both in the audio recording and in the text chat log. The estimating cloud cover learning activity to show connections between the water cycle, atmosphere, land, and biosphere. One additional method of integrating nature of science would be to split the classroom into groups where each group takes a section and have the groups work to form a system model of their individual models. I like that idea. Saharan dust over the Caribbean. David has the follow-up question, what two spheres are a part of the system? The reaction of tropical storms and Saharan dust. Using satellite pictures of Saharan dust when the storms are approaching the Caribbean to see how the storm changes its path. I can see that there's still people typing, so take a few more examples. Joanne says she's curious as why Christosphere isn't included. Maybe it's intended to be part of the hydrosphere. That would be where we go back to the framework, because the framework has a clear description of that disciplinary core idea and all that's in its content for each specific grade level. And so it may actually be that it's included in one of the ones listed here, or it may be that it comes into play after 5th grade. And I actually don't know the answer to that question, but I would go to the framework to look for that. And Maria says we measure precipitation, water pH, observe clouds, and report all the data with storm observations. I think that that matches the possible suggestion that I put into the slide. You could have students in your classroom collecting cloud cover and type and surface temperature data at the same time for 6 weeks. So they have cloud cover and type data, and they have surface temperature data that they're collecting for themselves and for the globe scientists. You could also have students identifying a question about the relationship between surface temperature and another factor, and have them identify what that other factor is, and conducting their own investigation to address their own question. So that'd be an example of where the assessment is going to be about them developing a model, but in preparing to develop that model, they may need to design their own investigation and complete it so that they have some data that they could use in the development of their model. Students analyzing their data and looking for patterns in it. That could be the data from their class project of the 6 weeks, but it could also be data from their individual or group projects about their relationship between surface temperature and another factor. They could be students looking at other globe data to see patterns, if the patterns that they've identified are common in other students' data, and also researching surface temperature and making a list of the factors that affect surface temperature. And so here, the students are gathering data that would be beneficial to them if the next step is that they're going to be assessed by developing a model to explain the relationship between cloud cover and type and surface temperature. And that would be an example of developing a model between the atmosphere and probably the biosphere. So all of these activities, they'd be building a context that would allow them also to explain the strengths and weaknesses in their model. And if you get into reading about the practices, you'd see that in developing a model, students have to be able to use that model to do something. And they also need to be able to talk about what are the limits of the models that they developed. But then again, maybe a different class would handle this completely differently. And you all came up with some excellent ideas about different projects that the students could work on. I was thinking about another example that the students could do. Maybe the class would do a research project about their region's geologic past and then use that to predict soil types that would be found in their area using what they have learned about parent material, past climates, topography, etc. Then they could use those predictions after making those predictions, they could go out into the field and do the soiled field characteristics protocol and find out if the soil types that are there are those that they would had predicted. And finally, maybe meet with a soil specialist and discuss any discrepancies between their predictions and the results. And then that would set them up to develop a model to explain why different types of soil are found in different places. So there are two ideas that come out of these examples, and they are that the student performance expectations are assessment goals, not a description of what should happen in the classroom, and that there may be several different ways for different teachers to incorporate different GLOBE activities, protocols, and resources to prepare their students for assessment for any single student performance expectation. Are there any questions or additional ideas? I agree. This aligns very, very well with the idea of backward design. We're starting with what we want the students to be able to do to demonstrate, and then we decide what's the best way to teach that. I also think it fits so well with GLOBE because we provide the protocol, which is maybe a foundation, but also support activities and other students' data and things that make it much easier for students to do real world science, to really be able to come up with their own investigations, not necessarily just do a cookie cutter. David found the chrysalis, I'm probably saying that wrong, cryosphere for us in high school. Thanks, David. Okay, and so the next thing that we wanted to do was show you where to go to learn more about the next generation science standards using the GLOW program website. And so what I'd like to do is stop sharing for a minute and share, I guess, my desktop. And so now you should be looking at the GLOBE homepage. And first we're going to take a look at how you would go about getting to the NGSS resources if you were a teacher or a non-US GLOBE partner. And what you would do is go to the Teaching and Learning section from the GLOBE home page, and then you mouse over that, and then you click on Learning Standards. And if you've been with GLOBE for a very long time, then you're probably already familiar with some of the other tabs in here. This third tab is the GLOBE Classroom Assessment Tool, which provides connections to GLOBE and the National Science Education Standards, benchmarks, TIMSS Math Framework, and other standards. For many years, this tool has assisted us in connecting standards, instruction, and assessment within GLOBE. We've recently added the Next Generation Science Standards tab. And there are currently 3 links in this tab. There's a little introduction where we have some quotes about how excited we are about the Next Generation Science Standards and GLOBE together. And then the 3 links are first to that framework. And if everything in this presentation, and if NGSS is new to you, then we highly recommend that your next step be to follow the link, the top link, and to download and read the framework for K-12 science education. This is the guiding document used to create NGSS. For me, the most useful parts of the framework are the description of the research leading up to the development, the explanations of the various changes in vocabulary, like that change from talking about science as inquiry to talking about practices, and the narrative descriptions of the scope for each grade level's disciplinary core ideas. If you can already quote benchmarks and the National Science Education Standards in your sleep, then the second document is probably where you want to start. This is the NSTA Reader's Guide to the Framework, and it provides the first steps in shifting your mindset to the new standards. And then the last link, Next Generation Science Standards website, takes us to where you can download the full standards, read them online, or use search tools to find specific standards for one grade, one disciplinary core idea, one topic, and many other filters. For those of you who are Globe partners, you can follow these next steps. And that is I'm logged in as a Globe partner. I'm clicking on, or mousing over Go To in the upper right of the page, and then clicking on the US Globe Partner Forum. And from there, I'm clicking on the Discussions tab. And the top thread is Connecting Globe to the US Next Generation Science Standards. And the top thread within there is NGSS resources. This has links to those documents we've discussed already and a few other links, including to the NSTA webinars and to some articles about, scientific articles about NGSS. Partners, please visit this discussion area, review the submitted resources, and contribute resources that you know about. Also, let us know which of these resources that you think should be migrated over to that teaching and learning tab. And I want to go back to the PowerPoint. Oh, I think I got the wrong one. Kristen, can you open the PowerPoint for me? Thanks. And while she's opening that up, does anybody have any questions about how to use the Globe website to find those resources? All right, so in that teaching and learning section, that's where eventually there'll be the alignment and any other documents to help Globe teachers and administrators, naturalists integrate NGSS into their classrooms using Globe. And in that partner forum is where we'll have the discussions about what should go over to the teaching learning site and then how we should use that in our professional development workshops to help all of our community integrate NGSS in the absolute best way possible. So now I'm going to turn the discussion over to Kristen, and we're going to do some brainstorming.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. I'm Kristen Wegner. I'm a project manager here at the Globe program. And now we're going to listen to you. We have a series of 3 questions And so I'm just going to put them up on the slide, and please feel free to type in the chat window your answer, but also feel free to respond to other participants' comments. So the first question that we're going to ask, what will teachers need to know about GLOBE to address the NGSS? So I think almost everybody here is related to the GLOBE community and part of the community. And so what do you think that teachers that you work with or teachers in other school districts and other schools will need to know about GLOBE that they may not know already about GLOBE for NGSS? See some people chatting. Okay, so Maria says interesting activities and projects to link them to the NGSS. Nice. So are there specific activities that you think are most interesting and projects that you think are most interesting when you talk about GLOBE to other people? Maybe you could give me some examples. Tom says how GLOBE will help them to instill science into their students using the students' immediate environment. Great. So using the actual school or their backyard or classroom. Lee says how to access and use the GLOBE protocols. Can you provide a little bit more information about that, Lee? Does that mean where to find it on the website or specific information that would mean? Joanne says, I hope I pronounced your name right, local relevancy. Nice. Marcy says, I think one big idea will be transforming from collecting GLOBE data for the scientists to using GLOBE data for their own investigations. Any tools we can provide, how to do that. Great. Maria says, using GLOBE protocols to conduct an investigation. Great, so tying the protocols to the overarching investigation, not just doing the protocol, but to connect it. Martha, how to integrate GLOBE protocols and activities with their curricula. Good. Hearing that a lot. Lots of people are saying the protocols and activities under the investigation. Richard, teachers need to know that there is a vast data that can be used to analyze. Great. And so by that you mean the GLOBE database that we have, correct? And how they can connect with that. Good. Nice. So Maria says use GLOBE protocols as a hands-on science lab. And Audra, practical application of GLOBE protocols. Oh, nice. This is a thing I hear a lot too. Joanne says, my students like to know how our data is used that we send. So it's not just going into this black hole, but actually knowing how it's used. And maybe that's even connecting back to how they're using it. Good. So we'll stick on this question for about 1 more minute, but as we transition, please feel free to continue thinking about this question. What will teachers need to know about GLOBE to address NGSS? Okay, so I'm going to transition to the next question. Oh, one more thing. Dave says, Joanne, the greatest thing that GLOBE students will be able to use in their own data is for their own investigations. Nice. And Marcy also added, teachers might need some case studies of how successful GLOBE schools have integrated use of the protocols into community projects. That's a great point, and that's something that we've discussed a lot with Marcy and Dave. And I'd encourage all of you to contribute to that conversation of case studies instead of just saying this is how a protocol aligns to investigation, actually showing how the teacher did that and what the students did. That's great. So question number 2, what resources should GLOBE provide to help teachers address NGSS? And maybe this goes back to what Marcy was saying too about the case studies. Joanne, that's great to hear. So she said, Roller and others at the help desk have been phenomenal in helping me. Great. And so I'm curious how they're helping you and how we can provide that to other teachers too. What are the specific things that you ask about Globe to address NGSS? Maria says activities, case studies. Good. So case studies on the activities, and by that I think you mean learning activities. And also tools to analyze all the student data. Richard, what type of tools? Maybe you could give me a couple more examples of what you mean by that. Maria says webinars where teachers can present their successful projects. Great. So like a live case study where the teacher can actually present what they did with the others. And that would be nice to get lots of different media and images for that too. Let me know if I missed some because I think there are a couple coming in fast. But Tom says wrappers for the Globe protocols to demonstrate system interactions. Great. So connecting how they fit together. Design projects to create instruments for monitoring the weather. Oops, just lost that one. Weather and climate, even if it's not data that was submitted. So Marcy says that she does like the idea of webinars for teacher sharing and other students presenting too. That's great. I think one of the big things people say about the community is they really like to see what the students do. So if we can get some student involvement for the webinars, that would definitely demonstrate case studies. Martha, scientists in the investigation areas who can communicate with students to support their ideas and questions. Good. So actually demonstrating that how the scientists can support this. Martha, do you mean as part of the webinar series that scientists in the investigation areas could support that? Okay. So Maria says international projects designed for different levels, elementary and high school. Richard, tools to find trends, patterns, or relationships between various protocols. Good. Okay. Jayan says we enjoyed Skype collaborations with students in Peru and VTC collaboration with students in Argentina. Nice. That would also be a good case study to be able to show that and to have your students or you be able to show that back with the rest of the Globe community. And Marcy, yes, we definitely do need that alignment document between NGSS, the Globe resources, and assessments, so teachers have something to take to their administrators. Okay, I'm going to transition to question number 3. Continue commenting on each other's comments on this and keep it going. And so this takes it one step further. What should a NGSS professional development or PD session during a Globe workshop look like? So if in a Globe training, we're going to offer a session on NGSS professional development, what types of things what would it look like? What would we have to include? So I'm hearing from a few of you the collaboration with scientists, and I'm just curious how we can use those collaboration with scientists to demonstrate how Globe addresses the NGSS. What type of tool or resource can we provide to the Globe community or to people outside the Globe community to show how to connect to those scientists and how to use that to address the NGSS? Awesome. So Dave says the collaborations really get at the 8th practice, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. I think that's one of the challenges too that a lot of teachers or schools might face of how to connect with scientists or how to get the experts in that. And so we do have the GISN, the Globe International Scientist Network, and so this is something that already exists, and so it's nice to show that this does fit the 8th practice. Great. So creating an alignment resource between protocols and NGSS. When it's Marcy's turn again, I'll give her Perhaps, Marcy, you can talk a little bit about what our goals are as Globe for creating that resource. Tom says, from the PD that we've done here, having the teachers experience the science the way the students will experience the science is an effective method. Awesome. So actually modeling it for the teachers and having them go through the process. Dave, maybe even the 7th practice, engaging in argument from evidence. Dave, do you mean that would be a PD resource? Okay, so Maria says, present the questions, gather the knowledge of the students, present his or her projects, allow questions and exchange of ideas. Should have lots of pictures and videos. I like that. I think we definitely need to include pictures and videos. So it sounds also like a case study of showing what the teachers have done, but really having it engaging so people can really get into it and understand it. The guest says, love the modeling idea. So it sounds like we have to have the teachers in these PD sessions or the partners in Globe trainings actually go through the framework and actually go through aligning it as an exercise. Marcy, connection to the scientists also help with other practices. For example, a scientist can help a class narrow their investigation to something feasible. Nice. So that also takes some of the work away from a teacher. So they can incorporate that process with the scientist and someone in their local community so that they can kind of help address the NGSS, but it doesn't rely on just the teacher coming up with all that. Dave says, oops, no collaboration. You're saying no collaboration? I think you're clarifying your past comment. Marcy says, PD might include some background on backward design model too. Nice. So I'm guessing probably modeling that again. Joanne, will scientists help to validate what student class is doing? Good. And then Dave, PD session. After teachers become aware of the protocols and learning activities, introduce the appropriate expectations from the NGSS and have them start looking for ways that Globe addresses the protocols and learning activities. Good. So I'm going to transition to Marcy, and please type in your ideas too. But Marcy, maybe you could talk a little bit about the workshop and some of our ideas of how we can create something too. I think it's really helpful to hear from each of you as part of the Globe community of how we can best serve your needs and also best serve other teachers' needs.
Thanks, Kristen. What a great set of brainstorming ideas. And we will capture this in the video recording of the webinar and also in a transcript of the web chat. What Kristen was talking about, the workshop, is that David, Kristen, and I are currently working on securing some NSF funding to hold a 2.5-day face-to-face workshop in which we would have people who are members of the Globe community and very familiar with all of the Globe resources, protocols, learning activities, resources that are available on the website that wouldn't fall into either of those two categories, and who also have a background in NGSS so that they know about the 3 dimensions and how the student performance objectives are set up and those types of things. Bring them all together and work on developing that alignment document between Globe resources and the standards so that we have a document to use as a basis for developing those models, developing maybe example units that might be done at specific grades, knowing where there might be gaps in the resources that Globe has available, so that we might know new things that we can do in Globe that we could very easily develop and then have available that would make our connections to NGSS even stronger. We're still working on securing the funding for that, but if you write to the Globe Help Desk and say you want to be a part of this, or if you have access to that partner forum that I showed earlier, if you go in there and say, I want to participate, then when we do have the information, we will pass it on. And we want to make sure that we involve in that workshop teachers, trainers, partners, and scientists in Globe so that we do cover the full Globe community. So I think we have just a couple of minutes where we could maybe answer questions or go back to anything. Oh, Kristen says you can email her if you're interested, and she's posted her email address into the chat window. And so I'll take just a couple of minutes if anyone has a question or a comment that they want to share with the group before we close. Our plan is that this is actually the first in a series of webinars about Globe and NGSS, and that throughout the series we will dig deeper into those conceptual shifts. Today we talked about the conceptual shift of dealing with three different things: the practice, the disciplinary core idea, and the cross-cutting concept all in one student performance objective. And then we also talked about the second one, which is having students' performance expectations as our standards, so that our assessment goal is the standard, as opposed to in the past where maybe just learning a fact was the standard. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. As you can see, NGSS has a potential to change teaching and learning. This webinar was just a brief overview. We hope to continue the discussion in future webinars and hope that you can join us. The recording for the session will be available in the Teaching and Learning Webinars section of the Globe website within a day or two. At this time, we'll